Hi, welcome. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Center on the Future of War here at ASU. It's a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. And many of you who are with us tonight know about the center and know about our work, but really briefly, we focus on research, education, and various service events,
Ready to
such as
roll.
reaching out to communication to community like here, um, and focusing on conflict understood in a very broad sense. This is the first event of our spring speaker series for 2022, and we're really thrilled to have Jill Goldenziel with us tonight. The title of her talk is The Art of Lawfare, the U.S., China, and Law as a Weapon of War. Jill's a professor at the Marine Corps University Command and Staff College. Her scholarship focuses on international law, U.S. and comparative constitutional law, international human rights, refugees and migration, and of course, lawfare, the subject of her talk tonight. She's in the top 10% of the most downloaded authors on the Social Science Research Network, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. That's sort of a big deal. She's also a public intellectual and has published widely in popular press, in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. She's appeared on National Public Radio International. She has a doctorate and a master's in government from Harvard University and a JD from NYU. Her undergraduate from Princeton, so she's very well qualified, and we're thrilled, Jill, to have you with us tonight. Very briefly for everybody out there, Jill will do her presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session. And the way the Q&A works is you can please type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom, and then I'll play the role of moderator and present those questions to Jill. And I'll try to get in as many questions as possible. So thanks so much for joining us this evening, and the floor is yours, Jill.
Great, thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here. Just give me a second so that I can share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? Excellent, okay. So before I get started, briefly, I'm a professor at Marine Corps University. As Daniel said, the views expressed in this presentation are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of any other part of the US government. I love my job. I'm happy to talk about a little more what it means to be a civilian professor at Marine Corps University, but for now, I'm going to be moving on with the presentation. Some of you may have seen this man before, Sun Tzu, who said back in the 5th century that supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This line of thought has come down through the ages and has turned into China's 3 warfares, or is reflected in China's 3 warfares, which underlie their military doctrine. These date back to 1963 or earlier, and were recently crystallized most clearly in the political work guidelines of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, in 2003. They are public opinion warfare, known as media warfare, which involves shaping public opinion both domestically and internationally. Psychological warfare, which is a little different from the way that psychological operations are thought of in the US military. It involves influencing foreign decision makers regarding China policy. So for those of you who are familiar with the way the US military thinks about PSYOPs, it involves more than influencing just decision makers. And then legal warfare, also translated as lawfare, involves shaping the legal context for Chinese actions using both domestic and international law. As the US government and the US military have pivoted towards China, we've done a lot in response to 2 of the 3 Chinese warfares. The US military has focused increasingly on information operations in recent years. The military has continually repackaged psychological operations, using them in conjunction with information operations, among other things. But they've done almost nothing related to lawfare. No one owns lawfare within the US government. There's no single office in the Department of Defense, state, justice, any other part of the US government, no single person that works on lawfare full time. And so I set out in this project to unpack this. So what does lawfare mean? And how can the US military and the US government focus on this further in order to counter PRC actions and other adversary actions in the world? So I'm going to talk about this more today. Here's the outline of the rest of the presentation. First, what is lawfare? Second, how does lawfare operate in practice? I'm going to focus on the case of the US and China because China has a more sophisticated legal strategy, lawfare strategy, than any other country in the world. But then I'll also give examples of lawfare worldwide, how it's been used in other situations, including in the Ukraine-Russia conflict that we're seeing develop before our eyes right now. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about building a US lawfare strategy and what that might look like in practice going forward. Then I'd be happy to take questions. So first, what is lawfare? Many of you are probably familiar with the term lawfare because of the blog in this audience. And I've got my lawfare mug here that I like to use for mindset purposes. But the lawfare blog, for those of you who don't know, is a fantastic blog, nonpartisan, bipartisan, academic, great analysis on national security issues, in addition to covering lawfare as I'm going to describe it below. But that blog is really a national security blog. It doesn't cover lawfare as a concept, certainly the way that governments around the world are using it. The term, in terms of military action, was crystallized and popularized in the US Legal Academy, first by Major General Charlie Dunlap, back when he was Colonel Dunlap. He's now a professor at Duke Law School. And back in 2001, he defined lawfare as a method of warfare where law is used as a means of realizing a military objective. And so the context he was looking at this in back in 2001 was the context we were in then. Post 9/11, he was thinking about violent non-state actors who were using things like human shields against the US. Human shields, as I'll get to, are classic lawfare, because human shields are often, in the simplest formulation, civilians being used in to block a military target, effectively, putting the US and other law-abiding nations in a bind, because if they targeted civilians to achieve a military objective, they would be violating the law of war in most circumstances, and certainly even if they arguably didn't, would put them in a bind in terms of proportionate questions about legal issues, but also in terms of any public opinion battle or optics on it. And so this is the context in which he really developed the term, and also was thinking about it in terms of the situation the military was looking at the time. Ord Kittry in 2006, who is a law professor and also is at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy in DC, wrote a book called Lawfare: Law as a Weapon of War. And it's really the seminal book on the topic, and expanded the concept further and talked about sanctions and other ways that states are using lawfare. But Kittry and Dunlap's definitions, I found, were not operational enough, not operationalizable enough, the way that military and the US government think about it, because they're broad. They're really too broad to be actionable by the whole of government, the interagency in the US, or the military. And they also don't fully reflect the way states are using lawfare today in a more sophisticated way than just the way that violent non-state actors looked at it, or or some of the, it went beyond some of the examples that Kitchery discussed. It's an excellent book though. So in 2021, I came around and developed a definition of lawfare that built on theirs. So I define lawfare as the purposeful use of law to achieve a particular strategic, operational, or tactical objective against a particular adversary, or to bolster the legitimacy of one's own or weaken the legitimacy of an adversary's strategic, operational, or tactical objectives. So this is a mouthful. I wish I could use something as pithy as law as a weapon of war, but I want to highlight the key terms here and talk about why I underline them. So first of all, lawfare has to be purposeful. Intent matters, as it does in so many areas of the law. It can't just be that any law passed by Congress involving a foreign country is lawfare. That would render the term too broad to be useful at all. And so lawfare has, if a law is passed, for lawfare purposes, it has to be done so in just that way, with the intent of being used to achieve one of these objectives or goals. It has to be targeted against a particular adversary to achieve a particular objective. So again, not just any law involving a foreign country, or to bolster the legitimacy of one's own actions or weaken the legitimacy of others. And for those of us who think about law for a living, this second point might seem obvious in some ways, but it's become more important than it's ever been because of the social media environment, because of the information environment in which all war occurs. And we all know the saying that the victors write the history books, but the history can be written by so many more people than it used to be able to be written in the past. The court of public opinion matters more often than ever than what actually happens on the battlefield. So this legitimacy piece is really critical in ways that it hasn't been, I think, in the past, or more critical than it has been in the past, because it's everywhere around us with social media acting the way it does, and social media serving as critical as a purpose as it does right now, say for reporting on war even. So I identify 5 different types of lawfare, some of which are newer than others. So first, battlefield exploitation lawfare. So this term was actually coined in my class by Lori Blank in my lawfare and information operations class that I teach at Marine Corps University. Exploitation of an adversary's law abidingness. So this is really the classic conception of lawfare, human shields, like I was talking about before. Instrumental lawfare. This is Ord Kitchery's term, the use of law to achieve a traditional military objectives. So Kitchery's example is sanctions. Yes, the US military could have taken out the Iranian nuclear sites, but that would have had some pretty big consequences if we did. So instead, we achieved the same objective using sanctions. You can argue all day about whether those sanctions worked well or not, and I won't here, but that's the concept. Instead of using military action to achieve the same objective, using legal means instead. Then information lawfare, the use of law to control the narrative of the conflict. This goes to the legitimacy piece I was just talking about. These are the 3 that I'm going to mainly talk about today in the interest of time. But for those of you who are interested in reading further, you can do so in my article, which I have here, Law as a Battlefield. You can't see it against my screen, but Cornell Law Review article covering all of this material and more. It's called Law as a Battlefield, the US, China, and the Global Escalation of Lawfare. And in that article, I discuss in depth 2 more types of lawfare. One is institutional lawfare, which is the creation of new laws and institutions to support one's military or strategic efforts. So this is not new. The US we created the UN. Well, it was our former president, Woodrow Wilson's idea to create the League of Nations in the first place. Headquarters is in New York. We have, as a country, dominated what has gone on there. Not entirely, but we've dominated what's gone on there, especially in terms of a lot of what the agencies do, of which we are the primary or plurality funder of many of them. We've used the UN a lot to achieve our strategic aims. China's taken this to another level. Instead of playing in some of these institutions, or rather in addition to playing in some of these institutions, they've created their own. So US dominates the World Bank, fine. They created the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank in order to be able to create alternative institutions that they can nominate to be involved in and assert influence over. And then proxy lawfare, legal actions against adversary proxies. The case that I identify for this is lawfare between the US and Huawei, and also lawfare involving Sabrina Ming, the CFO of Huawei as well. Don't have time to get into this too much today, but there's been fascinating battles in the courts since the US effectively banned Huawei's telecommunications equipment from being used by the US government and military in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019. There's been a huge PR push by China, by Huawei, excuse me, in litigation after that. And well, the reason that the NDAA banned the telecommunications equipment in the first place is because of Huawei's close ties to the Chinese state. So I identify that as an instance of proxy lawfare, with Huawei being the proxy for China there. So I'd be happy to take some more questions about that in the Q&A. So examples of how to use lawfare. Before I get into what's on this slide, this is where it's important for me to stop and say what lawfare is not. Lawfare is not a substitute for warfare. I'm definitely not saying that. I am not naive enough to think that nations are going to beat their swords into plowshares and start using gavels instead. What is happening in the world, and what I see is increasingly happening in the world, is that nations are using law as an alternative to kinetic traditional conflict, or as a part of that conflict to supplement it or achieve military aims in some way. And this is a trend that I think is very much likely to continue, especially if great power competition ramps up the way that many of us fear. So how can lawfare be used outside of armed conflict to shape the environment, as the US military would call it, set the terms for conflict or negotiation, file a lawsuit in an international court, say, and that will set the terms for negotiation going forward over maybe a border dispute or something that two states might have conflict over, many states. Create facts on the ground. Possession is 9/10 of the law in US law. There are analogies in international law to that as well. And lawfare can be used to assert territorial claims in that way and in other ways. Frame the narrative of conflict. Information lawfare. Use law to bolster legitimacy or undermine an adversaries. Then lawfare can be used during armed conflict as well. It can be used in all of the ways I just mentioned, and it can also be used at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of war. It's my dream that the entire military that every soldier, Marine, sailor would know something about lawfare and would be able to, when going out into the field, whether that's kinetically or otherwise, be able to issue spot, okay, this is what our adversary is doing in order to try to cement a legal claim of some sort, and this is what we can do in response. I don't know that we're going to get there, but I'm definitely trying to set the stage for that. I also want to emphasize here that lawfare is not just for the military. It's not just for the Department of Justice or the State Department. It's really needs to be part of a whole of government approach. And I'll get more about that later in the presentation as well. All right. So let me give you some examples of lawfare. We'll start with China's Maritime Militia. Little background here that's necessary before I dig in. This is a map of the South China Sea. It is important, as many of you know, for a lot of reasons. These numbers are a little disputed depending on the source, but roughly a third of the world's commerce goes through there. $3 trillion in trade a year, huge oil and gas reserves, both real and hypothesized, and huge fishing stocks that are really important to the protein needs, the food security of the countries surrounding the South China Sea, but also to traditional ways of life and to countries' GDPs. China claims everything within the 9-dash line, which is this little, not little, this very large tongue-shaped area here. China claims all of this as its own. But that's not what the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says, to which China is a party, as are most of the countries in the world and its neighbors. These blue lines are the unclosed borders, or the unclosed borders of the countries surrounding the South China Sea. So you can see that there is quite a large disputed area of overlap in here. Another way to look at it is this. These are the occupied features in the South China Sea. So any land mass in the the seas of the world, when we don't know whether it's an island or a reef or a rock, is known as a feature. And so these are the occupied features. Ignore the names. Those are the commonly used names. They're not necessarily the legally used names, but as you can see, there's a lot of flags in there. And there are a lot of places where there's more than one flag. So it's a hotly contested area, and a lot of potential flashpoints for conflict exist there as various nations sail through with their military and commercial vessels, including the US's military vessels conducting freedom of navigation operations, which we are the primary ones to do in the South China Sea. So the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, PAFM, or the Maritime Militia, is used primarily for battlefield exploitation lawfare. Many of you have probably heard of Russia's little blue men, or let me go back on that. Russia's little green men that were used in Ukraine for plausible deniability, I'll say, during the Crimea conflict, although that was rather implausible in my view, where there were green men wearing unmarked uniforms who turned out to be Russian special forces in the end, conducting operations in Crimea that then resulted in its occupation. China's maritime militia is also known as its little blue men. They appear to be plainclothes fishermen. They're on vessels like the one pictured, fishing vessels. They are under the military chain of command sometimes. They are members of local and provincial commercial organizations. So they're civilians, but sometimes in their off time, they are on the Chinese military payroll. And we don't know. Right. The US military doesn't know. It'd be possible for anybody to know, difficult for anybody to know. If they encountered a vessel like this in the South China Sea, okay, am I dealing with a civilian? Am I dealing with a combatant at any given time, since they're on the payroll sometimes and sometimes not? These are fishing boats, but a lot of times they have no nets. They're not conducting any fishing. And they're not broadcasting their anti-collision signals that they're required to do for safety of themselves and others under international law. They train with and support the Chinese Navy and the Coast Guard. They're engaging very much in supporting military functions, although often in quote unquote, certainly outside of armed conflict, conventional armed conflict. They're a reserve force, known as a reserve force, but they are in fact in routine use. How are they used? China uses them in several ways. One is what's known as its salami slicing strategy. So think about a salami, you want a snack, you first cut off a little bit, and then like you're a little hungry later, you cut off another little piece, and then you think, I'll just have a little piece more, and then suddenly the entire salami is gone and you've like blown your diet. Same concept, except talking about the South China Sea instead. So China is engaging in a lot of actions with the Maritime Militia that add up to no one of which is generally going to be cause for, say, the US to launch military action against them, but which together add up to a fait accompli in terms of getting territory or convincing their neighbors to give up claims to territory. Cabbage strategy. So what we see with the cabbage strategy is maritime militia boats swarming an island. And then, so like 30 of them surrounding an island at once. And then in back of that small island, say in the Philippines, you see a row of Chinese Coast Guard vessels. And then behind that, a bunch of Navy ships. And this starts to really intimidate people living on the island, and perhaps with the goal of convincing them that it's not worth it to live there anymore, or that it's not worth for their government to be defending that area anymore. The use of the maritime militia does reduce the escalatory risk for China of, say, having its Navy perform the same functions or its Coast Guard perform the same functions. So here's an example. This is Pagasa Island in the Philippines. In one day in April 2019, 95 fishing boats from the Maritime Militia swarmed the island. And talking to some naval officer friends, this is a nightmare if you are a Navy vessel, Navy captain, sailing in the South China Sea, say conducting a freedom of navigation operations. Because first of all, under international law, the Navy vessel would be the giveaway vessel to the ships. And it turns out that it's really not that easy to turn around a large warship on a dime. And it's a lot easier for these small fishing vessels to float on by. That's an exaggeration, but float on by in the South China Sea. And these fishing vessels from the Maritime Militia have been used to ram ships in the past. If that happens, that's $8 million worth of damage, roughly, to a Navy vessel, and a huge diplomatic incident, public relations incident, because it looks like David versus Goliath. If one of these boats rams, even if that boat rams, it's up against a Navy vessel, and it's a fishing vessel on the other side of it. Other ways the Maritime Militia is used. Rights protection missions. These are presence missions in disputed waters, obstruction, reef, and island development. We'll get to the Chinese building of islands in the South China Sea in a few minutes. They coordinate with maritime law enforcement, conduct landing on the artificial islands. They protect, quote unquote, protect fisheries. That can involve illegal fishing as well, or what I call fishy lawfare. Illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing is a huge problem in the South China Sea, and China is the largest perpetrator of that. They also perform military intelligence functions, anti-air missile defense, like weapons use, recon, and surveillance. Again, they look like fishing boats, even though they're part-time civilians, even though they're performing a lot of these military functions. And they're also used for emergency response. So as I mentioned, there's a huge problem under the law of armed conflict here. And there's an almost bigger problem should actual kinetic armed conflict actually break out in the South China Sea. Because are these people combatants or civilians? Are these civilian fishing boats, commercial fishing boats that are not sponsored by the Chinese government? Or are they civilians supporting hostilities or plain old combatants at any given time? It's almost impossible to know until after the fact. Maritime militia members would, just to review the law here, they're not combatants under international law unless they're directly participating in hostilities, but they're not part of the regular armed forces, and they're not volunteers. They don't meet the criteria for combatants that I have here under the Geneva Conventions of 1949. So outside of armed conflict, they're performing lawfare functions. The information lawfare function that I mentioned before, particularly the David versus Goliath issue, is a huge concern. But they're also engaging in legal preparation of the battlefield. They're swarming islands. They're fishing when they are fishing. They're establishing presence over fishing grounds that belong to other countries under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They're being used to create facts on the ground to shore up China's claims to features in the region. In April 2019, Admiral John Richardson, who was the chief of naval operations at the time, told his Chinese counterpart that the US won't treat the maritime militia different than the Chinese Navy because they are being used to advance China's military ambitions. However, that's easier said than done. It's still very difficult to actually target something that looks like a civilian, and it could be illegal to do so under the law of war. Maritime militia also play a prominent role in the South China Sea arbitration between the Philippines and China, which came down in 2016. I prefer to call it the Philippines-China arbitration because of the contested area involved is known in the Philippines as the West Philippine Sea, but it's known by both names. So this is Scarborough Shoal. As you can see, it's got a Filipino flag on it. It looks like a bunch of rocks. And the US was not too keen in 2012 and 2013 to go to war over these rocks. Philippines certainly couldn't do it without the US's help. But Chinese fishing boats, maritime militia vessels, were harassing Philippine personnel around these shoals in 2012. And around the same time, China started building artificial islands in the South China Sea. So this is Mischief Reef, which is in the Philippine borders, I'll call them, under UNCLOS, on January 24th, 2012. And this is Mischief Reef on October 19th, 2015. So you can see here, pretty stark difference. It's an infrared image. You can see it was very much mostly underwater. And by 2015, it's developed, it's on land. And if you look more closely, this is what's on it. So runways, hangars, control towers, radomes. China claimed publicly at the time that it was not using these islands for military purposes, but they certainly look like they are ready to go should armed conflict break out. You can see why the Philippines might not want this in their territory, in their backyard, at the very least. So they had to do something about it. Not being willing or able to go to war, they filed a lawsuit. They did so in the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is in The Hague. I have that there because when pundits and scholars also refer to The Hague, they're usually referring to the International Court of Justice. And this was misreported in the media a lot as being the International Court of Justice for that reason. But the Permanent Court of Arbitration is effectively a courtroom that various tribunals that are created under international law that don't don't function full-time as courts can use. And so it was actually a tribunal under the it was an international tribunal on the law of the sea that was sitting in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague that this case was filed in. And China didn't participate in the arbitration, but their interests were very much represented. So what happened was that China rejected participating in the arbitration because they said that it was illegal under international law because the states were supposed to negotiate first under UNCLOS, which is true, and claimed that the Philippines did not try to negotiate enough. Obviously, the Philippines did not agree with this, but they refused to participate in the arbitration. But then something very strange happened. At the jurisdictional phase of the arbitration, China released what they called a white paper that looked very much like a legal brief. It was written in the form of a legal brief. It had all of the arguments, including arguments on the merits that they would have made in the case had they participated in the case. And the court effectively treated this as their brief, as their submission before the court, as if they had been participating in it. They bent over backwards to accommodate China's interests. There was a judge who had a Japanese wife who recused himself because he didn't want it to even appear that there was some sort of conflict of interest involved. They actually went to the South China Sea, which is very rare for a court to do, in order to understand the issues better, because they knew that this case was going to have a lot of importance. The case was not about sovereignty itself. It was filed under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but it had tremendous implications for sovereignty because in order to decide the dispute, the court needed to determine whether the various features in the South China Sea that were under dispute were rocks, islands, etc., that generated various maritime claims. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, subscribed to by most of the countries in the world, and it covers the rights and responsibilities of nations regarding the use of oceans, including the environment and natural resources. And various claims were brought under all of these issues. So what did I mean when I just talked about the different features in the South China Sea? Different features, depending on what they are, generate different rights. And this has a lot of implications for both the sovereignty in terms of the borders that states actually control, but also for their exclusive economic zones, which in an area rich with fishing stocks and oil and gas is particularly important. So if a feature is an island, it generates a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, basically the right to anything under the sea within those 200 nautical miles. Rocks do not generate an exclusive economic zone or a continental shelf, but they do generate a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. So it still increases your territory. Low tide elevations disappear at high tide. They don't generate a maritime entitlement, and they also can't be occupied. Reefs, as many of the features in the area are named, are a type of LTE. This is just a depiction of the same information that was on the last slide. It's easier a lot of times to understand graphically instead. So the decision was almost a sweeping win for the Philippines. It's even more so than most commentators had expected, although most did expect the Philippines to prevail. China's maritime entitlements in the South China Sea can't exceed those established by UNCLOS, according to the court, basically invalidating the 9-dash line. No features in the Spratleys were held to be islands, so they don't generate the 12 nautical miles territorial sea and the exclusive economic zone. And those are some particular features as well. The other key points of the arbitration decision were that China unlawfully interfered with the Philippines' sovereign rights in the EEZ and the continental shelf, unlawfully constructed artificial islands, violated international environmental law and traditional fishing rights of Filipino fishermen, endangered Filipino personnel, failed to follow anti-collision regulations, failed to stop Chinese nationals from interfering with rights and endangering fishermen and personnel, and unlawfully aggravated the analysts claim that the arbitration didn't have much of an effect because China didn't abandon its artificial islands, and because its law enforcement vessels and militia continue to operate in a dangerous manner. But China has not built any new islands since then, and they have allowed Filipino fishermen to access Scarborough Shoal since then. So it did appear to have some effect. Just as interesting to me is that China has shown some fear of this arbitration. So this is a billboard in Times Square that I have up here. China ran a video 5 times a day for about 6 weeks to 2 months following the arbitration, telling its side of the story in the United States, but in a hub in the United States where foreigners from all over the world could see its side of the story. Why would they do this? If they rejected the lawsuit entirely and dismissed it as a piece of waste paper? Only if they really care about what this lawsuit means for their legitimacy in the international community. And they also launched a huge messaging campaign before their population and before the world. Xi Jinping allegedly offered Duterte an oil and gas deal in order to abandon the terms of the arbitration, which he did not in 2019. And China's other neighbors in the South China Sea have begun to reference the decision in their diplomatic communication, in their submissions to UN bodies. There have been other lawsuits rumored, and every time this has come up, China has harshly smacked them down in the press the next day and warned its neighbors against filing them. So there does seem to be some fear of the meaning of this decision here, which I think is significant, regardless of whether the actual islands were abandoned or not, which I don't think anybody really expected them to do. So I'll talk about lawfare worldwide, and then I'm going to save building a US lawfare strategy for the Q&A because I know we are running short on time. China is not the only perpetrator of lawfare. I'll just give you a few more examples of lawfare going on all over the world. So Russia's little green man in Ukraine, you can see pictured here. Russia's also using Arctic lawfare, where they're making their own claims, that certainly minority views in terms of international law, under UNCLOS in the Arctic. They've gone as far as to plant a flag on the floor of the Arctic to try to claim some territory there. It's fascinating stuff. Ukraine actually has a national lawfare strategy against Russia and has for a few years regarding Russian incursions into Ukraine territory. They're using international investment arbitration to target Russia, in addition to filing cases in the International Court of Justice and European Court of Human Rights. There's a great Ukrainian lawfare website that I encourage you all to take a look at. The US has used institutional and information lawfare. I used the example in my article of the rule of law fighting force that they set up in Afghanistan in order to build a rule of law, in order to build trust and partner capacity. Information lawfare. I have another article coming out on how the US botched the messaging involving the strike that killed General Soleimani in January of 2020. Well, Iran got the messaging right, even though they got the law wrong. And that messaging the US's botched messaging there has come back to bite it, certainly in terms of blowback from its own analysts, but also the world. And future South China Sea lawsuits, those are rumored again and to be happening. And Indonesia has called a meeting of law enforcement and defense ministers involving a potential plan of action for the South China Sea that's supposed to happen sometime this month. So something to look out for. So I'm hoping the US government can do more in order to counter this and make lawfare as predominant in our own military doctrine and whole of government strategy in order to better combat our adversaries and work together with our allies who have put far more emphasis on lawfare than we have, which I can also talk about in the Q&A. And I look forward to your questions from there.
Thank you so much, Jill, for a really fascinating presentation. You covered a lot of ground, and I just want to encourage everybody here who's attending, if you have any questions, please just drop them into the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to them as best we can. So one quick question is, the term lawfare, plays off of warfare, and it suggests that the mechanisms of law are leveraged in a way that's that serves an end similar to warfare. But if we expand the understanding of lawfare so that every use of law as part of a state's presence in the world is understood as lawfare, doesn't that do potentially some damage to law? That is all international law and all use of legal mechanisms out in a diplomatic space really just a form of lawfare? Is that the right term we want to use, or is there some danger to adding the fair to all law?
So I wouldn't add the fair to all law for precisely that reason. I really like the question. That's why I'm smiling. I'm just trying to go back on the slide. Let's see here. So that's why I have my mouthful definition, because I think there is a potential for damage to law if the term is used too broadly. And the term also becomes meaningless in itself, because so many of our laws involve foreign countries. So it's not just law, it's how you use it, is what I would say. As with so much of war and so much of law, particularly criminal law, intent is the key here. So that's why I use purposeful use of law. That's the critical word there. And it also there has to be a target. It has to be targeted against a particular adversary to achieve a particular strategic operation or tactical goal. So otherwise, I think you're right. It would be, first of all, damaging to law. Law would start to be viewed with skepticism by our adversaries, and that's not something we want in the United States. Would also start to be viewed with skepticism by our public, but the term would also be useless.
Would you consider all forms, all sanctions? I mean, sanctions require a legal mechanism to put them into place. They're not always legal in some sense of the word, but would you consider any sanction used for some strategic purpose to be a form of lawfare?
Not necessarily, no. And this is a question that I've wrestled with really since the outset. It would have to, and I haven't, to be honest, the sanctions literature is so vast that to truly answer that question, I would have to dig through decades of research to say any sanction. So I would have to say no on one hand, but that's an unsatisfying answer because I can't think of an example of one that's not necessarily, right? We use, well, I don't know. I have been thinking about this issue in my head, so I'll, to give a quick answer on that, I mean, certainly if it's used against another country, probably, but there would have to be, if it's used against another country to achieve a otherwise military, strategic, operational, or tactical objective, probably. And that's most of the time why we enact sanctions against other countries. If it's against a particular individual, maybe not, because often we use them punitively, which is not necessarily warfare or lawfare in itself.
A question here from Marcus Goodwin. What might be the best venue or means for the national security sector of U.S. foreign policy to operationalize lawfare? Is it on a whole of government approach led by the White House? Is it something on ambassadors, chiefs of mission worldwide, combatant commanders, or delegated authorities? Where would be the best place to implement this doctrine in a meaningful manner?
Great. So I can go back to my slide here. So I think there needs to be a lawfare office. I hesitate on the best place for that to be. I mean, I think my ideal would be that there would be a permanent person on the national security staff who would be dealing with lawfare. But that's not really how the national security staff works, because every president comes in with their own priorities and reorganizes it. So then the question becomes, okay, so where should it be? Where in the interagency should it be? And there are problems with that everywhere. Because if you house it in the Department of Defense, then that potentially reduces it to a defense-only type function, and it won't work if it's a defense-only function. There's many whole of government efforts that need to occur. If it's housed at state, well, that's problematic too. First of all, the State Department can have less priority in certain situations than it should, without getting too political. But we have seen defense prioritized over state in various administrations of various parties over the past decades. So does that deprioritize lawfare as an issue too much, given the historical risk of that happening? Does it take it too far out of the Department of Defense? If it's housed within justice, it's Department of Justice doesn't do international relations in the same way that state and defense do, for the most part. It's not. The Department of Justice is not our hub, or sorry, yes, the Department of Justice is not our hub for international relations strategy. So I don't know what agency it would be best to be housed in. What I would like to see is just more socialization of the concept, more work on it being done within the interagency, and perhaps points of contact, the way there are civil military representatives at, say, state aid, other agencies that would be really fluent enough in lawfare to be able to have interagency meetings and coordinate on it.
Well, it's fortunate that you're teaching where you are, because that's an environment where you might be able to have some real impact in that regard. A question from Luke Nelson. This is an interesting question. At the tactical and operational level, I'm seeing a lot of the vocabulary used for lawfare is also used in or similar to terms in information operations. Is it fair to think of lawfare, when considering planning at the tactical level, military-wise, as an information tool for how the global stage will perceive our actions on the ground?
Yes. Absolutely, 100%. I do expand on this concept in an article on information lawfare, which should be coming out. I'm looking at because it's on my left for final edits. So it should be coming out imminently in the Journal of National Security Law and Policy. And in fact, that's why I chose to teach my class on lawfare and information operations. Why I made that up, because that's really precisely where I saw it being most useful. And maybe not most useful. I don't want to constrain myself there, but really most immediately and easily applicable, because it's the legitimacy piece in warfare is, again, I think, more important than it's ever been, and that's something that I think that the I talked to a select group of service members who are biased because they're my students, but not entirely anymore. And there's something to it there. We've at Command and Staff, we ran a legal war game that focused very much on this idea of information lawfare. And it was developed at the National Defense University and is being used for both US and international students in professional military education all over the US and the world. And we had the students wrestling with these very issues of, all right, well, what do you do in a certain situation where battlefield exploitation lawfare is being used against you? And then how do you respond in the media? And how's the adversary going to respond? Because we're thinking adversary in this game. And it's something that I think that more of the military beyond the student body at Command and Staff needs to be thinking about.
So a somewhat related question. The international human rights is a sort of body of law that intersects, I guess, with lawfare, but how would you view its proper management, say in the case we're talking about China, of repression of the Uyghurs? To what degree is human rights a good lens for something that conceptualizes engagements as adversarial as compared to sort of the perspective taken from human rights that it's a general set of principles, applied equally to all players within the world, and its legitimacy and its power comes from that status rather than its status as a sort of tool of a particular state's, interests.
So the way I look at the world, Dr. G's view on the world is the incredible thing about international human rights law and the Geneva Conventions and so much of it, UNCLOS and so much of other international law is that we've gotten as many states to agree to it as we have. Now, whether they actually follow it is another thing, right? But it is so hard to get 2 states to agree on anything, much less 176, right? So, and 100 or 193. In Geneva Conventions, we have more agreement than really almost any other treaty in the world. And so this is the common language, this is the common lexicon that the world has agreed to. And even if they're not following it, a lot of our diplomacy over the years, a lot of the world's diplomacy over the years has involved naming and shaming the countries that don't. So we need to be using this language more and the law to our advantage. Like to the most part, for the most part, it's on our side, right? Whether the US quibbles with this, that, okay, we haven't signed on to UNCLOS because we don't agree with certain provisions or certain political interests in the country don't agree with certain provisions of it. Yeah, I wish we would sign it, but the fact is we haven't, and that hasn't changed the fact that we are the world's largest enforcer of it in terms of our freedom of navigation operations. And most of it is codification of customary international law, which is why we hew to it in the first place, even if we haven't necessarily signed it. So we have this incredible tool in this law that we have not only signed on to, but we've shaped it. Most of these treaties, even when we haven't signed on to them, oddly enough, we've sent like massive teams of lawyers from the State Department in order to get language in there that we like, and then we're just not using this tool in our arsenal. So even if we're not, even if we're not perfect, and even if all of the countries in the world aren't perfect in terms of their living up to the letter of international human rights law and other treaties, I think there's more we can be doing in terms of lawfare to use it to our advantage.
Thank you so much, Jill Goldenziel, for joining us this evening. Thank you all and the attendees for spending some time with us. We're thrilled that, Jill, you presented on lawfare so eloquently and opened our spring speaker series this way. So our next week's presentation will be by Nellie Lahoud on conspiracy theories in the Arab world. And Nellie's a pretty extraordinary scholar and is about to release the definitive book on the Bin Laden papers that were discovered in Abbottabad. So thank you again. We look forward to seeing you at future events, and have a great evening.